rises up, pays every single creditor, and comes back into the public life of Bombay.
So he rises up, so the second time, by doing, he has the largest reclamation company, Back Bay Reclamation, Churchgate Reclamation. Those of you who know Bombay, all that Marine Drive is reclamation. And they reclaim it and they create Marine Drive. And so I associate Premchand, why he's my favorite, is because I lived in Bombay and I used to live close to what is called Rajabai Tower, which is the library of Bombay University next to the High Court. And that tower to me is one of the nicest buildings of Bombay. It's named after, he gave 5 lakhs of rupees, a lot of money in that time. He gave 5 lakhs to build that tower in the name of his mother, Rajabai. Okay, so very quickly, we are running out of time. Tell us quickly about your third hero, Arunji Nathji Tarwadi, who became the Honorable Shroff to the East India Company during the unsettled period after the Mughals collapsed and before the British rose, were Maratha wars and was a really lawless period. And here is a Gujarati merchant who actually becomes the honorable banker, honorable shroff to the East India Company. He's the one they can pay the salaries to the soldiers because of him.
Yeah, for me, he's really the hero because the period that I'm fascinated by is precisely the period between 1750 and 1850, the latter half of the 18th and the middle of the 19th century, which is really a century of transition. One was never quite sure what was happening. You had, as Gurcharan said, decline of Pax Mughalaya, Pax Britannica hadn't yet been articulated, and this is a period of generally of some degree of confusion. And it's precisely exploiting the lack of a coherent political order that you have an autonomous merchant who represents what I call the bazaar in Indian business. I mean, you have the high capital market represented by the banks, but you have this intermediate bazaar, which really becomes crucial in the 18th century because here is a man who is able, with his hundi, his promissory note, able to bankroll the wars of the English East India Company because, like a good merchant, he hedges his bets. He knows on which side of the war he can expect his funds to be repaid and who's not going to repay him. So it's very clear as he sees the century unfold that it is the English East India Company that has the military advantage, does not have the financial advantage. So Arjunji actually bails the company out, and he's therefore instrumental, I will say, in enabling the way in which the company expanded from 1757 to 1818, when the Marathas are also defeated in that famous battle, and India really becomes part of the British Empire.
Thank you, Lakshmi. And now all you have to do is to go and buy this book from there. Now, let me just take the last few minutes that we have before we have time for a Q&A, I hope, or not? 10 minutes. So I'll finish in 5. So we have 5 for questions. I wanted to complete the story. Caravans. Caravans is the story of how the Punjabi Khatri merchants in Multan carried goods to Central Asia and Russia through the Himalayan path. So it's Punjabi Khatri merchants on the Silk Road. That's the Silk Road. And the author here is Scott Levy. And what struck me here was that on any fine day in spring or autumn, you'd have 20,000 camels crossing the Khyber Pass, laden with Indian spices, with luxuries, and also slaves. We don't talk about it, but they also took slaves, and they were going up to Bukhara, Samarkand, what's now Kazakhstan, to Tashkent, and then to Russia, Moscow. And they created caravanserais where the merchants lived. And they lived for 10 years, 15 years. Sometimes they took on a wife from the local community. And they celebrated Diwali. They had their Brahmins who did all the puja and everything. And then if somebody died, then was a problem. Because then the police and the army had to be called for doing a cremation ceremony. And these were Muslim people, and they thought ghosts were coming out of the out of the burning bodies. Anyway, quickly moving on, we have another wonderful book called by Chaya Goswami, Globalization Before Its Time, the Gujarati merchants from Kutch. So this is the Kutchi trade, and well, you have a famous Kutchi here in Bangalore, Azim Premji. He's a Kutchi, and so this community is very interesting. They created a golden triangle trade, and this was a trade from the port of Mandavi, which is no longer exists, to dhows that would carry Indian cottons to Muscat. At Muscat, they picked up pearls and coral, and they went to Zanzibar in Africa, where they picked up ivory and slaves and brought them to India. So for 250 years, this trade prospered, and the English didn't even know about it practically. It was under their eyes. We have a volume called Goras and Desis. Goras and Desis is after the East India, Lakshmi was telling you, after the East India Company, when it was declining in its trade in India, opium saved them actually. They broke the monopoly of East India Company, so private trade came up. So that private trade was a lot of agency houses, and these agency houses were the ones who became later Tatas, Birlas, they all are managing agents. And that's the organization structure. And this describes wonderful story. And the first managing agency had an Indian as a partner. His name was Dwarkanath Tagore. So, quickly again, this is a book on the Indian building of the Indian railways. Again, everybody has a nice romantic railway story inside them. And this will feed on to those stories. And finally, the Dharma of Business, which is pre-modern commercial law, but applied to today's issues that we have, the ethical issues you are discussing of Narayana Murthy and Sikka in Bangalore, or Tatas and Mistry in Bombay. These are the issues this book raises, called the Dharma of Business. So, I think we are now open to questions. We have 4.5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. You can start.
I think he needs a mic.
We can hear you.
Said the exchange rate was 1:1, and before that I think our GDP was also very high, and our trade also was very, very high based on the historical numbers we have. Do these series also cover how British really plundered? And especially the book I liked about is the railways. Does it talk about the purpose of railway was not to actually give benefit to the Indians, but it was to draw the resources out?
Yeah, okay, got you. What his question is, did the British plunder India? Were they bad guys or good guys?
Is it covered in the book?
And really, I think the later history, despite Shashi Tharoor's book, which is very selective, by the way. The reality is that there's a lot, it's not an easy story. It's not all bad. There's a lot of good in the story. We blame the British for making India poor. But in fact, the weavers, India's largest source of India's GDP, India represented 25% of world GDP at the time. That's correct. That's because of the of cotton textiles, which has been historically India's big export. And I'm sure Lakshmi will agree with me that it was actually technological obsolescence that killed Indian weavers. Now, we could have given some more protection, slow protection to them, but the reality is that handlooms died all over the world. They were just technologically obsolete. The mills, handloom mills in England, in America, in China, everywhere died. India had the largest, so we had the largest suffering as a result. But this is just one example of a story that, any other questions?